Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on looking at colonialisation and the links to the UK, which we're really happy that Dr Emily Zobel Marshall has agreed to lead. My name's Alison Lowe and I'm Chief Exec of Touchstone. Helen? Hi, I'm Helen Kemp, I'm Chief Exec of Leeds Mind. And we're really delighted that we have with us Dr Emily Zobel Marshall, who will introduce herself in a few moments, but we just wanted to explain how we'd come to arrive at this point. So it is Black History Month, as many of you will know, and throughout the whole of October, Leeds Mind and Touchstone have been working together to celebrate the successes of our Black staff and the Black communities that we serve across West Yorkshire and parts of South Yorkshire. And we wanted to have a brilliant closing event that would help our staff and the communities that we serve understand how racism is as real today as it ever was, but to understand some of the legacy of empire and colony that still existed today. And so obviously the best person to do that was Dr Emily Zobel Marshall. So without much more ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen to introduce Dr Zobel Marshall.
Hi, I am delighted to welcome Dr Emily Zobel Marshall, who is reader in Postcolonial Literature and a course director at Leeds Beckett in the School of Cultural Studies and Humanities. Emily regular hosts and chairs literary events, so we're so excited that she's with us today and has had many publications. Emily uses oral history, and as Alison and I are both history graduates, we really understand the importance of listening to stories and how stories really influence us and how they help us make sense of the past, but also understand the present. And I think there's nothing more relevant than that today within, let's say, Black History Month with Black Lives Matter this year. So I'm really excited to hear you and really excited to now hand over to Dr Emily to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Helen. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. So what I want to talk about, I want to explore the history of UK's links with colonialism. And I want us to hopefully come to the end of this presentation understanding a little bit more about how the history of colonialism, the history of enslavement, has fed into some of the racist experiences that people in the UK still experience today. So I'm going to take you on a sort of a global journey and also a historical journey. I'm going to endeavour now to share my screen so that I can show you some PowerPoints. I think Helen, we might need you to enable screen sharing for me to do that.
That's not me.
Or perhaps Alison.
Yeah, it's Tatiana, the finance team, so there, she's done it.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, so you should all be able to see my screen now. So the title of my presentation is going to be called How We Remember Black Lives Matter Protests, Stately Homes and Statues in the UK. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes and then I'd love to have to hear your questions and to have a bit of a discussion afterwards.
So I don't think we can see your screen.
You still can't see. Okay, one moment. With always these teething problems with technology. So I'm just going to try that again.
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes, brilliant.
Excellent. There we go. Lift off. So my presentation is titled How We Remember Black Lives Matter Protests and Stately Homes and Statues in the UK. So it's going to be in three parts. I'm going to start by looking at the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK and their impact on the politics of our country, and especially focusing on the kind of momentum the Black Lives Matter protests gathered over this summer. I'm then going to turn to looking at stately homes and the history of enslavement in the UK and how we can see that in our stately homes, how we can see that in the physical environment around us. And then finally, I want to end with the tragic story of David Olawali. And we're going to think about statues and memorials, and how we can best remember the past and honour the past in our cities today. So to begin with, looking at Black Lives Matter in the UK. The UK saw a wave of protests over the summer, and indeed these were global. What was significant about the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer is that so many people were on board, people from different ethnicities, different classes, different walks of life. So it was truly a coming together of people from all backgrounds. And we saw Black Lives Matter protests erupt in America, but then also other countries looked towards their past and used the protest movement to try and tackle issues, historical issues that were pertinent to their particular history and their particular country. Now, some people may think, and I'm sure our audience here don't, but that the Black Lives Matter protests really started this summer, but obviously, you know, they didn't. The hashtag Black Lives Matter really took off on social media after the shooting of the young African-American teenager, Trayvon Martin. That was in February 2012. He was an innocent boy. He was in a white neighborhood, and he was shot by a man called George Zimmerman, who was then acquitted of his murder. And it was the anger in America of this acquittal that really kicked off the Black Lives Matter movement. So there were all sorts of protests calling for justice for Trayvon Martin. It's easy to think that the problem of police brutality against Black people is an issue over in America, that it's an issue over there rather than over here in the UK. But this is absolutely not the case. And I'm going to end by talking about David Olawali, which is David Olawali's death, which happened in Leeds at the hands of police officers, is the first recorded death of a Black man at the hands of the police in the UK. And this is a Leeds story, so it's very significant to us. What is interesting about the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's a very much decentralized organization. So in the past, with civil rights movements in the US, you had strong Black male, predominantly male leaders. So people, for example, like Martin Luther King. There was an argument that the civil rights movement really looked after mainly the needs of Black men, so that even though there was a call for justice, for racial justice, it didn't focus on gender equality. And so, so the rights of women were not at the forefront of the movement, and women were not leaders in the same way in the movement, in the civil rights movement. What's interesting about the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's predominantly organized by women, and it has a very strong feminist agenda. It embraces women, it embraces non-binary identity, transgender identity, disabled people, and other marginalized people. So the key founders of the movement, Elisa Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tomenti, are all women. So this is, I think, very significant about the movement. What is also significant is it doesn't have a centralized system of power, which is why it kind of seeds in all sorts of different ways around the world. So people have used the umbrella of the Black Lives Matter movement to call for justice in all sorts of different ways because there isn't a centralized organizing body. So in that way, it can manifest itself in many different ways. It's more flexible. In the UK, over the summer, we saw thousands of protesters march in solidarity with the US protesters. And a vast number of people, as I mentioned before, who took part in the protests were not of African ancestries. A lot of white people on board, and people from all different ethnicities and racial backgrounds, and that was what really marked that movement in the summer. And in my view, this is not a battle that can be won alone. So everybody needs to be on board. Everybody needs to be an active anti-racist, and by not speaking out, by not challenging racism, if you're silent, you're also in many ways compliant. So we all need to speak out. It's not just a black issue, it's an issue for everybody. And that's really, I think, that it was that feeling that powered that passion over the summer. Another interesting element, I think, to the Black Lives Matter protest this summer was obviously coronavirus and the pandemic. I'm a bit of an optimist, and I like to think that there was a shared sense of human fragility in the face of the virus. We all suddenly understood what it was like to be vulnerable. At the same time, as we know, the virus is not an equalizer, and people from ethnic minority and Black communities have been much more adversely affected by the virus. Black people are 4 times more likely to die from coronavirus, and all sorts of issues such as poor housing and education and access to jobs have been highlighted by the virus. So there's 2 ways of looking at the way in which the pandemic kind of intersects with the Black Lives Matter movement. So just to give you some figures in terms of policing in the UK. Official figures show that police in England and Wales are 3 times more likely to arrest a Black person than a white person, and 5 times more likely to use force. And these figures are from 2018, 2019. Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. Since 1990, there have been 1,743 people in England and Wales who have died following contact with police, according to the charity Inquest. As a proportion of the population in England and Wales, Black people are twice as likely in the UK to die in police custody. And force or restraint is more than twice as likely to be involved in their deaths. So those are very stark figures, and those show us that police brutality and racist policing is an issue here in the UK, as well as in the US. There have been factors, which highlight the inequalities in the UK very starkly recently. So, for example, the Brexit vote, which in many ways one could argue gave people permission to voice their prejudice. Anecdotally, my mum is from the Caribbean, and she's much darker skinned than me, and she came to live in England in the 60s, and she said that in the main, she felt welcome in the UK. And it was only after the Brexit vote that she started to feel a sense of hostility towards her presence here. And she lived in Leeds, and she said that, she was in the sauna one day, and a man said, you shouldn't be here, you don't belong here. And this was very soon after the Brexit vote. So there's this sort of more hostile environment that we see in the UK in the wake of Brexit. The Grenfell Tragedy in 2017, which led to the deaths of 72 people, many of them from Black and Asian backgrounds, also highlights the kind of neglect that more impoverished and ethnic minority communities face. And the Windrush scandal, of course, where thousands of people from the Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean and Africa were wrongly told they were in Britain illegally. So these events in the UK highlight our social divides and our problem of racial inequality in this country. Just turning to the slides, so you can see on the slide the Black Lives Matter protest in London in June 2020. So you see this sort of huge mass of people, and at the height of the coronavirus pandemic, so people are also putting in many ways their lives on the line to go out and protest peacefully, and to protest in a way, with masks as well, in a way that is safe. These are protesters stopping to sit in the road during it was called the Million People March in London on the 30th of August this year. And then Leeds had its own big protests. So this is the Black Lives Matter protests in Millennium Square on June the 14th, which was again very peaceful, very well attended, and very sort of safe protest. So Leeds has played a role, very much a kind of leading role in those protests. There was another protest also held on Woodhouse Moor on June the 21st. We had Black Voices Matter and Black Lives Matter in Leeds, and they both came together to call for equal rights. There's been a huge amount of media interest in the Black Lives Matter movement, and that was particularly noticeable after the toppling of the Edward Coulson statue in Bristol. And I'm going to come back to that momentous event that happened this summer in a moment. Here on the screen, you can see the All Black Lives Matter UK demands. And this is another grassroots organisation that has been born out of the Black Lives Matter movement. As I've sort of outlined, there are different organisations, which are born out of that kind of seed out of the Black Lives Matter movement. But the demands of All Black Lives Matter UK are: commit to ending racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, substantially reform the education system, commit to ending racial health disparities, implement the recommendations of all the reviews undertaken by the government. And this is an issue that came up several times in the summer. David Lammy, the politician David Lammy, highlighted this. There have been lots of reviews, there have been many recommendations, but are these recommendations actually leading to change? The Windrush reviews, Lammy review, and so on. And finally, point 5, stand with the Black community in the United States and formally denounce the human rights violations currently being committed against the American people. Now, moving on from the Black Lives Matter protests, I want us to think about stately homes and history of enslavement in the UK. So how our physical environment, how what we see around us has been affected by a history of racism and trauma. To thoroughly explore this, I'm just going to do a kind of, and this is going to be brief, but a sort of brief sort of recap, if you like, of the historical context of the Atlantic slave trade. And obviously this is a huge subject and can't be just condensed into one slide, but I think it's important for us to remember these figures and to keep them in mind, and through remembering, we start to see how the past affects our present. So the Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration of people in human history. 12 million Africans approximately were shipped from the West African coast to the Americas. And when we say the Americas, we mean North America, South America, and the Caribbean. In 1482, it was the Portuguese who built the first slave port on the former Gold Coast, that was on the West African coast, and then the Dutch, the Spanish and the British take part in the slave trade. So the British were hugely active in the slave trade, and I think it's the sort of the bicentenary of the slave trade, for example, was very much focused on William Wilberforce and how Britain ended the trade. And in a way that skews the narrative. It sort of makes Britain seem, on the right side of history in many ways. The British were hugely, heavily involved in the slave trade. And there were horrific conditions for the enslaved at every stage of the journey from Africa to the Americas. So on the coast, the enslaved were herded to the coast, and many died in that journey from the Central Africa to the coast. Then in forts, again, many deaths in the slave forts, where slaves were often kept for months at a time, chained together before they boarded the ships. Middle Passage, so that's the passage, as you'll well know, from West African coast to the Americas. 1.5 million enslaved people die, which is just, a horrifying statistic. And the poet, the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott, writes a beautiful poem called The Sea is History, which talks about how, in many ways, the history of the of people of the African diaspora is under the sea. The sea itself is history. It's under the sea that there are so many losses. In the plantations, a third of the enslaved die in the first 7 years in the Americas. So it also gives you a sense of how Black lives were seen as, as kind of throwaway, that it didn't really matter how many slaves died, because there was this resource in Africa where more and more slaves could be let's say, stolen. So, and Campbell writes, the historian Campbell writes that apart from the physical violence, the field slaves, so the enslaved in the plantation, was exposed to every form of outrage and mortification to break his spirit. So there was not just the sort of physical enslavement, but there was also a form of psychological enslavement, like trying to break a person down, as you might kind of break a horse in. So a sort of huge psychological impact, which is the result of that sort of continual violence. You'll probably be familiar with this diagram, which shows the ships and how packed in the enslaved were in the ships of Middle Passage. This is called the Brooks ship diagram. It was actually drawn up by an abolitionist to show the horror of the conditions at Middle Passage. And these are some of the implements. Again, this is from abolitionist material, but these are some of the instruments that abolitionist Thomas Clarkson bought in Liverpool. So you have some of these implements of torture used on the enslaved, handcuffs, some thumb screws, mouth openers, and leg shackles. So, and I am aware, that I'm sort of skipping over great swathes of history here, and Helen and Alison are both historians, so obviously I hope you understand that the time constraints. So I have to sort of sketch over some of these details, but the slave trade was abolished by the British in 1807. Slavery continues in the British colonies until 1833, and in the US it's abolished after the American Civil War in 1865. Across the Americas, conditions improve very slowly. So we see abolition, but we don't see a great change in the way that the enslaved are able to live in the Americas. So there's still endemic racism and a lack of access to proper pay, to proper housing, to proper jobs. So things don't change quickly. And although enslavement is over, the British Empire continues to grow throughout the 19th century. It keeps its colonies until the mid-20th century. So where we see the end of enslavement, we also see the growth of empire, Britain conquering much of the rest of the world. And here's an example, here's a map of the British Empire from 1886, and you can see the bits that are pink are parts of the British Empire. I think just to pause for a moment on this map, it's a very interesting map because you can see, that the way that Britannia likes to depict itself at this historical period. So you see Britannia seated there, with people from the colonies at her feet, and her loyal subjects, if you like, and Britannia center stage. With the subjects at her feet, her sort of adoring subjects, if you like. Very interesting to look at paintings from this period and to think about how these representations tell a story around how Britain liked to see itself, and how these things also facilitated colonialism, these ideas, these representations. Now moving again quite quickly into our present moment, and we see in this summer, June the 8th, 2020, we saw the statue of Edward Coulson being thrown into the river in Bristol. So Edward Coulson was a board member and deputy governor of the Royal African Company. And he helped to oversee the transportation of an estimated 84,000 Africans from Africa to the Americas, and around 19,000 died in Middle Passage. So for 125 years, this man, Edward Coulson, was honoured, at the heart of the city in Liverpool, so literally put on a pedestal. And then after many petitions, so there are petitions trying to get rid of this statue going on for decades, and the council didn't listen, the powers that be didn't listen. Finally, the Black Lives Matter protesters topple the statue of Edward Coulson. And this becomes an iconic image of the summer, of the summer 2020, where we see him being thrown into the river. And, you could argue there's a poetic justice there, that he ends up in the water like that 19,000 enslaved people who died in Middle Passage, whose bodies would also end up in the water among the fishes. The statue's been taken out of the water now, and is going to be exhibited, but with all the graffiti and so on still on it, to show the actions of the protesters and his role in history. Now, Alison and I took part in a review of statues in Leeds, which was an absolutely fascinating process in the wake of the toppling of Edward Coulson's statue and the challenges to other statues in cities in the UK. Leeds decided to look at the statues that it had in its city, and the council commissioned a review to see if there were statues in Leeds which were considered objectionable, statues like the Edward Coulson statue. So each statue was examined, the history of each figure, and it went to public review as well. It was a fascinating process to be involved in. It made us think a lot about Leeds. It made us also think, Alison and I are in agreement here, that Leeds doesn't have necessarily a great display of public art, and that much of what we do see in the physical landscape of the city being honoured are the lives of great white men, and the lives of royals, of people involved in the colonial regime, and very few women. And in a way, the art that we see around us in the city doesn't reflect the multicultural, diverse nature of Leeds as a city. So things are being done to rectify that, which I can move on to in a moment. But one of the statues that really kind of was one of the focuses of the review was the Queen Victoria statue in Hyde Park, which was erected in 1905. And you see that it was graffitied on during the Black Lives Matter protests. So people have written Black Lives Matter, slave owner, justice, Black Lives Matter, murderer, and the graffiti was removed. And during the review, we peeled back layers, and Queen Victoria's reign comes after enslavement, the period of enslavement after emancipation. But what people find problematic about this statue is the way that Victoria sat on a throne, and then you have around the statue Africa, Asia, and the different parts of the world that Britain dominated as a colonial force. So the recommendations of the review were that we would change the signage around these statues to incorporate counter narratives. So not just the narrative of great, the greatness of the country and the greatness of these historical figures, but to think about how they might be problematic, to give people who are looking at the statues a much more balanced history. So one of the things that we see as a result of the colonial regime is this very kind of binary distinction between what was people that are considered civilized and uncivilized. And you can see here, these are some adverts for Pears soap, which we still use today. And interestingly, if you look at the advert on your right, which is the white man's burden, Pears soap, these are adverts that were created during the colonial regime. And the idea is that actually what Britain is doing is actually helping people in the colonies by bringing them civilized ideas, by sort of helping them out of the darkness. And the idea of the white man's burden is the idea that is the white man going into the colonial countries is actually a burden for the white man, because the white man is then tasked with trying to improve the so-called natives, trying to improve the way they live, to drag them out of savagery. And this is the narrative which has framed the colonial regime. And why I'm telling you this is because that narrative, still leaks into the way that people see the world today. And that's why it's so important to try and challenge that narrative, and to challenge that narrative of Britain's greatness, which is what we were doing with the statues review, and also what in many ways those protesters in Bristol were doing with the toppling of Edward Coulson's statue. So try and create a history which incorporates multiple narratives and diverse stories, not just a history of the conquerors. I want to turn to thinking just about stately homes. Now, probably all of us have been on a day out to a stately home. And stately homes in the UK are, considered to be sort of one of our great, historical artifacts. Now, there's been a review recently, again in the wake of this change that we saw over the summer, of the National Trust's historic buildings, and up to a third of the National Trust historic homes had slave trade links. This may not come as a surprise to you. But if we're talking about the way that we present our history to the public, what we find in a lot of stately homes is that there's a kind of silencing around that history and the links to enslavement. So we have these grand stately homes, and they are beautiful places because of the labor of the enslaved in the Caribbean and in the Americas. That it's based on that labor, that blood, that sweat, that we see all this magnificence around us. The National Trust is facing up to this, is working with a project called Colonial Countryside to address this story, to address this history, to better address it in its houses. In Leeds, we have Harewood House. So Harewood, was again, the Lascelles family were heavily involved in the slave trade, had plantations in Trinidad, in Jamaica, and in particular in Barbados. There are ancestors of the enslaved on their plantations that are still named Harewood, because their ancestors toiled on the plantations owned by the Lascelles. So I've been consulting Harewood House about how we can better uncover the history of enslavement in the house, in the permanent exhibition. I would argue at the moment you could still perhaps visit the house and not be aware fully of its history, and that needs to change. I'm going to pause here to share a poem with you that I've written about Harewood House. So I'm going to sort of take off my academic hat for a moment and just put on my poetic hat. And this was a poem that I wrote in response to some minutes that I found, which was a meeting. There were minutes from a meeting of Harewood House curators, and they were discussing how to better address the history of the house and the history of enslavement to the public. And one of the curators, it is minuted that one of the curators said that we have to be very careful not to spoil a good day out. And I think this is one of the issues that Britain kind of grapples with in the way that the stately home is open to the public. It's the idea that, we want to have, it has to be a good day out. And I would say, well, for who? Because personally, for me, if I take my children to Harewood House, I want them to know about how their ancestors toiled to create this beauty. So the poem is called, in response to that idea of a good day out, it's called A Good Day Out. Nowadays at Harewood House, you can visit penguins. 2 p.m. is feeding time. You can watch silvery fish disappear down feathered gullets, take a boat on a shimmering lake, munch scones and drink tea. It's such a good day out. Below deck, in the cavernous kitchen, a sign celebrates old culinary treasures: sugar, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, once filled these cool, dark larders, spilling their scent into Yorkshire stone. In times past, cook had them at her fingertips. She knew their journey well. Her hands spiced and sweetened cakes and puddings for lords and ladies upstairs reclined. See, here are her dented baking tins and trays, authentic and robust. This history, take it in. It's such a good day out. But cook knew the other story of every Hessian bag of sugar warmed by island heat, each grain distilled from macheted canes, felled by sun-whipped hands. She understands. There is no sweetness here. The story of the sugar and the slaves that made her masters rich falls silent on her lips, for it would only spoil a very good day out. So I'm working with the house, and hopefully we'll see some changes there in terms of how to balance that idea of having a narrative which incorporates that history properly, and also making it an attractive place for the public to visit. If you're interested in finding out more about Harewood House and enslavement, there has been an excellent project which was led by George Wolvin, which examines the history of the house and its connections. So I've just put a screenshot up here of the website that you can visit. I could send it round to you if you're interested in finding out more. There's all sorts of documents, such as the ledgers of the enslaved, that are also accessible through the Borthwick Institute in York. There's also some really interesting stories about some black servants who served at the house. So this is what we might call the hidden history of Harewood House. But just to add that also the Lascelles are also keen and focused on acknowledging this element of the family's history, and the house has spoken out in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement. David Lascelles has spoken out in solidarity, and also the house is involved in a lot of anti-racist projects and projects to help young people, for example, the Geraldine Connor Foundation, so to help young people of colour in Leeds through the arts. Right, this is the last section of my presentation, and I want to talk to end with talking about David Olawali, so our own Leeds story. Now, I imagine that some of you will be familiar with David Olawali's story, and I think it's very pertinent to people working in Leeds Mind and Touchstone who have focused on mental health. So this is David Olawali's life story in brief. This is a picture here, an artist's depiction of Olawali. Now, David arrived in Hull in 1969, and he was a stowaway on a cargo ship from Lagos, Nigeria. From 1953 to 1969, David endured mental ill health, homelessness, racism, destitution, and police persecution. And this culminated in his drowning in the River Aire near Leeds Bridge at the hands of 2 policemen. Now, I'm a vice chair for an organisation called the David Olawali Memorial Association. And we believe that this is the first case in the UK of policemen causing the death of a Black person that has been recorded. There's more information on the David Olawali Memorial Association there. We've got a great website, please do visit it. If you just Google David Olawali, you can find out more about the work that we do. What was significant about the David Olawali case is the way in which the police officers, Ellicott and Kitchen, hounded Olawali. They made it his mission to degrade him and psychologically disturb him. They set fire to his newspaper bedding when he was homeless. They banged his head repeatedly on the floor of the police van. For example, in January 69, they arrested David and kicked him so hard in the groin that he was lifted off the ground. They would drive David, they would always go back to the spot that David slept at in the doorway in town, they'd return to his spot, and they would take him in the middle of the night and drive him to Middleton Woods and leave him in Middleton Woods to disorientate him, to try and get back home. And David actually always returned to that same spot, which I think it could be interpreted as an act of protest. You know, he refused to be moved. He always returned to the same doorway in the city centre. So in 1969, 2 police officers were seen pursuing a man in the Coulson in the River Aire, and then later a body was found in the River Aire that was David Olawali. And several police testified to Ellicott and Kitchen's assault on David. The jury found them guilty of aggravated bodily harm, but acquitted them of grievous bodily harm. So Ellicott had 3 years in jail and Kitchen had 2 years and 3 months. So the David Olawali Memorial Association used this tragic story of what happened to Olawali, a migrant who suffered from poor mental health, was also incarcerated at the Hyde asylum for several years, and was homeless. We use this tragic story to try and fight for social justice and to highlight issues around mental health and homelessness in the city. I just want to quickly add that this is not the entirety of David's life story. When David first came to the UK, he had a job, he worked hard, he loved to party, he loved American music. Apparently he was a fantastic dancer. And he was well loved by his community. People knew him and liked him. And then we see this slow decline. And as a result of the way that he is treated by our institutions here in the UK. So the Olawali Memorial Association hosts a variety of events. And what we really believe in is using the arts as a platform to call for social justice. So using poetry, literature, and art as a way to call attention to social inequalities, and using the story of Olawali to try and move forward and make sure nothing like this happens in Leeds again. So here you can see we commissioned an anthology of poetry responded to Olawali's life story, and there's been this momentous kind of reclaiming of Olawali in the arts. Poets, writers from Carol Phillips to Linton Kwesi Johnson have written about Olawali, have taken this sort of silent history and made it visible through artistic form. And what we've also done is brought the story of David Olawali onto the road. And you'll see a picture here of King David Olawali, and that was created by a sculptor Alan Pergessy, and we have I'm involved in a carnival troupe, a Leeds West Indian carnival troupe called Mama Dread's Masqueraders, and we decided that we wanted to bring that story on the road in carnival, which was a very difficult thing to do. And people said in the troupe, why should we take this tragic story? How can we make that something carnival? Carnival should be a happy, celebratory time. But carnival has always been very much involved in the political. And so we formed a troupe called Orlawi Migrants, the David Olawali Mass. And we dressed as hibiscus flowers because hibiscus is a symbol of remembrance in Nigeria. And then we had the King Olawali leading us. And the idea was to bring attention to the lives of migrants and the lives of disenfranchised communities in the UK, and also highlight, some of us were dressed as boats as well, and the sea, to highlight the plight of migrants coming over from the African coast to Europe, and the many migrants who die at sea through that journey. So this sort of ongoing loss of lives in the sea. So those are some examples of ways to remember, creative ways to remember the past and to remember the histories and the tragedies of the past, so that we can move forward into the future and not repeat them. And I'm going to end my presentation there, and I look forward to receiving some questions.
Brilliant. Oh, I'm really blown away by all that, and Helen and I are going to take the questions from the chat and relay them to Emily. But the first one that I've got is, how do contemporary racial politics differ, in your opinion, in the US and the UK? How is this reflected in the American and British Black Lives Matter movements?
Thank you, Alison. So I think, as I said in the presentation, I think there is an issue in the UK of thinking that racism happens over there in America, but not over here in the UK. And because of our the different kind of complex social makeup, of our system here in the UK, the forms of racism do differ. There is a sense, I think, in the UK where we don't see as much overt racism, but the British people have a way of being covertly racist, and a lot of people from the Windrush generation focusing on this in their narratives. So there's early Caribbean migrants in the 50s coming over to the UK. The idea that a British person won't tell you straight how they feel about you, that they reject you, but they'll find all sorts of ways of making it clear that you're not welcome, that you don't belong. So it's that covert racism that is difficult to tackle here in the UK. The big difference in terms of the struggles of the Black Lives Matter movement is there's not the use of guns in the UK. So we don't see the same number of deaths of Black people at the hands of the police through the use of arms. But I gave the figures in a presentation, so that's not to say that we don't see institutional bias and also all sorts of sort of ingrained racisms in our institutions and especially in our policing institutions.
So do you think we are institutionally racist in the UK?
I think that sorry, Helen, carry on.
Is it getting any better?
I think that we've made great strides forward in terms of the way that communities intersect and come together. But I think there is a real need for dialogue. I think we are institutionally racist. I think that there are all sorts of prejudice and racisms, deeply embedded in our political and, as I said, policing institutions here. But for us to really try and confront bias, prejudice, racism, we need to be in open dialogue with one another. And I think that people shy away from asking questions that are uncomfortable, and people shy away from self-scrutinizing. So thinking, how might I be a part of the problem? Or how could I do better? Or, I feel like this about a particular subject, why do I feel like this? Let's try and break that down. The great thing that we can all do is to have a conversation with somebody who thinks very differently to us. We're all a little in our echo chambers, especially on social media. So to try and create a dialogue, and that's what I try and do in the classroom with my students. I try and get the students to think about their positionality, what they bring to the table, and how they can scrutinize elements of their privilege and their social economic positioning.
No, thank you. And can I just ask as well, I think your poem was amazing, really, and I don't know if somebody's put a link to it, because I think it'd be nice to go back and read that. But I was in the Caribbean earlier on this year, before COVID, in January, and went to a plantation house. Yeah. And I was absolutely shocked. There was no mention of the slaves.
Wow, yes, yeah.
Which sort of made me think again, is that again because of we don't want to spoil your day out. I actually had to ask the person and say, how many slaves, where did they live? There was it was all about the landowner and the gentry and the family that had lived in the plantation house, not the slaves.
That's outrageous, isn't it, Helen? What island were you on?
That was on Barbados.
Yes, and that's quite telling as well in some ways, because you could argue that Barbados has a kind of nostalgia for the colonial past even more than some of the other islands. That probably get me into trouble, but there you go.
Oh, and I was really quite shocked.
Yeah, and in the US, there's a big a trend in plantation tours, where people go on buses to go to different plantations, and they take you. I've been looking at the feedback and the discussions of the people who like to go on these plantation tours, and the way that advertised online, and it's very much a kind of nostalgic trip down memory lane. Let's go back to the plantation past where everybody knew their place, and here are these were the benevolent masters, and look at their beautiful houses, and have you seen the curtains in this particular plantation house? These are the kind of conversations that people are having about the houses, and also this is how the houses present themselves. So I think it's by no means unique to Barbados. We see this all across the United States as well, and it's terrible. And it's in the States especially. It's a national nostalgia to go back to that period, which is frightening.
Mm.
And that was particularly the case in St. Thomas when I went a few years ago. The huge American ships disgorging all these white people to come and have a look at the plantation and the slave market, which is still there. So
yeah,
yes,
it's a spectacle, isn't it? It's a spectacle. Yeah.
So I've got a few questions in the chat. So there's one here from Astrid, who says that she's been trying to explain Black Lives Matter and the issues of racism to her 9-year-old son, and she'd be really interested in any resources that you could point her to.
So for now there's I'll put the links in the chat, but there's a particular project at the moment which is being run by Speaking Volumes, which is focusing on all the different texts that we could use for primary age children to teach them about diverse histories and histories of colonialism. So I'll put a link in the chat for that, but it's called Speaking Volumes. There's also an online museum of Caribbean heritage that has a whole load of resources that are useful for directing school-age children tours. And I think that we think sometimes that we need to shield our children, from some of the harsher realities of our history, but actually school children are very open to that kind of discussion, and I don't think that we should shy away from it. So I'm really glad that you're having those discussions with your son, and that's really important. But it's an educational resource by Speaking Volumes and also the online Museum of Caribbean Heritage. And perhaps, Alison, what we could do is send an email around to all the participants.
Absolutely.
With some of the,
and if you send us your slides, we'll send everything around to all the participants.
Yeah, and I could send that round if we note down the question. Thank you for that.
So Helen, do you want to pick up Abdullah's question?
I would, but it's just disappeared off my screen.
There. Have you got it? Shall I read it?
Yeah, sorry, can you read it? It's gone upwards on my screen.
Okay, so Abdullah says that is a black male working for Leeds Mind, brilliant, and he'll be leading on a new service for young black males, which is going to be called Young Black Minds. Can you reflect on positive and negative ways race and mental health are related? I think you've done that a little bit with David Olawali.
Yes. So the positive and negative ways in which race and mental health are related, I think that they're deeply related issues. And the theorist Frantz Fanon, you might be interested in some of his work, Frantz Fanon, as I said, who's from the Caribbean, who's writing in the 1950s, was one of the first people to really link the effects of race and racial injustice on mental health. And what Frantz Fanon highlights is how perpetually being at the receiving end of racism can cause all sorts of mental disturbances, can actually cause psychological problems. And Fanon, as well as being a writer, was also a psychiatrist. So he worked with patients in Algeria who were under the French colonial regime in asylums. And he noted that a lot of the indigenous people, the Algerian people who we found in the asylums, were actually suffering from mental health issues as a result of racist society in which they were living, where they were being treated as second-class citizens. So Fanon is really, Frantz Fanon is really the person that really begins that conversation about mental health and its effect, and how racism affects mental health. Another writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is an African writer, who writes, he's from Kenya. He's written a wonderful book called Decolonizing the Mind. And I think that's a fantastic phrase, decolonizing the mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And what Ngugi argues is that colonialism and racism affects the way in which we see the world and the way in which we see ourselves. And for people to improve their sort of sense of self-worth, they need to it doesn't mean just a process of physical or economic decolonization, but the mind, the psyche needs to be decolonized. So that's a sort of peeling back of layers. And it's only after that peeling back that people can start to really honor themselves and appreciate themselves and see themselves for who they are, rather than seeing themselves through the eyes of others. So I think this is what often happens in a racist society, is that people see Black people, people of color, see themselves through the eyes of others that are looking on at them, in contempt. And that is where these mental health problems occur. I'm sorry, Abdullah, those are mainly negative things. And I suppose the positive thing is to have those conversations, to have those dialogues, and to think about how a negative experience around race and ethnicity have framed people's mental health.
Yeah, and I suppose Black History Month is an opportunity for us to celebrate our Blackness. I love being Black. I'm proud of the colour of my skin, and I think that we need to reframe the narrative of white people and history in inverted commas, and we need to make our own history. Being Black is a glorious, wonderful, joyous thing, and yes, we recognise all the harm that othering causes us from white people and institutions. But if we believe ourselves that being Black is something to glory in, then that will be part of our protective factors, as well as the love of our families, our food, our cultures, our heritage. All that is a protective factor and is a major positive in maintaining positive mental health.
Exactly, Alison, absolutely well said. And that idea that celebration of Blackness, celebration of Black culture, which is what this month, is partly about. I say partly because 12
months of the year. We want it
every year. Why just 1 month, and the rest of the year is that what, White History Month?
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
Question?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. I think I had a problem with my Wi-Fi and I've lost all the chat, so I can't see any questions. I'm sorry, Alison.
Alison, I can see an interesting one from Nicola.
Yes, yeah. So how can I start a dialogue with older people who seem to think that bringing these issues up are a sign of a snowflake generation? I don't really understand what snowflake's supposed to mean. It was a cold thing when I was a child, so I don't understand what you think.
Well, so snowflake is a diss at the current generation of young people who are seen as being like really overly sensitive, and so they'll kind of melt at the slightest, criticism. They can't handle anything, and you have to couch them in cotton wool because their egos are so fragile, and their ability to function is has been kind of eroded by being overparented or looked after too much. Pardon? Not our kids. It's not mine either. But it's a myth. It's a myth. It's that idea of the snowflake generation is created by the older generation, and people throughout history have always been saying this about the next generation. Oh, they're pampered. They don't know how to behave themselves properly in our day. It's a typical slight of one generation to the next. I think that it's outrageous to call the younger generation a snowflake generation, Nicola, when you think about everything that this young generation have to put up with, you know, in terms of the politics of today, of what's happening with Trump in the US, of, you know, the issues in the UK. We talked about Windrush, we talked about Grenfell, all the issues that the Black Lives Matter movement brought up, and now the global pandemic. It's certainly not a snowflake generation. This is a really resilient generation that don't have a lot of the advantages that previous generations have had, especially economic stability, job stability, being able to buy your own house, those sorts of things that make you know, life much more much easier to live. Just anecdotally, my students are coming in to do small face-to-face sessions at university. They're 18, and you know, it takes a lot to leave your home in the middle of a pandemic and come to university to study. So certainly not a snowflake generation, hugely resilient. I think, Nicola, that you can perhaps point this out to this older people who are saying it's a sign of a snowflake generation, show that this certainly isn't. It's a very resilient generation, and that I think that probably some of the issues that older people might have, and I am generalizing here, is that the issues that are being brought up, they probably find it feels threatening, it feels too new, you know, there's a whole new vocabulary to get your head around, and maybe they feel that they're being in some way criticized, you know, for ideas that you held, you sort of previously held quite, you know, as your own truth. So it puts people in a defensive position. But the key thing is to have these dialogues with people who start off by not agreeing with you. So Nicola, if you can find, you know, a point of connection and then gently challenge, but both the idea of the snowflake generation, but also to try and dig a little deeper to see what it is that is making these older people feel they need to be dismissive or that they need to be defensive, because you'll probably find a raw nerve there. And if you can help to resolve that, then you're making great progress.
I agree. And that links to another question from Eden about how you combat racism from family members, especially when they think that they're reciting facts. So they've got Trump obviously on Twitter and they're reciting the facts of Trump. And how do you combat that ignorance, really?
Yes, it's a difficult question, Eden. How do we combat racism from family members when they think they're reciting facts? I think you need to try and help them unpick where they have found these facts. So you could start with a general discussion around the media and how the media likes to get us to think a certain way, how the media can be incredibly divisive. You could think about which newspapers, which news sources these facts have come from. You know, have they come from Facebook? That could be deeply problematic. Has it come from a very right-wing website or a right-wing newspaper? And try and show them that these sources have a political agenda, and often it's a type of divide and conquer political agenda. So if I think interrogate the source of the facts and try and show them that these facts are in fact not facts but are deeply biased, and that they are often, you know, people are being manipulated for a purpose to suit the needs of politicians. So try and get them to analyze the source, and that might be one of the first ways of combating that kind of racism from family members.
Brilliant, thank you.
I've got my chat back now. Can I just ask this question from Emily, because it's something that interests me as well. How can white anti-racist allies best find the balance between speaking out and showing up and not dominating the conversation or putting too much on Black friends to educate us?
That's a really good question, Emily, and thank you for asking that. And I think that's been a question that a lot of people have been asking over the summer. And what was amazing about the Black Lives Matter movement is that growth of what people are calling, allyship, the growth of allies, that people from all racial backgrounds, came together. So how can white anti-racist allies not, I guess, dominate the conversation, and not also use Black people as a kind of resource, an educational resource? I think one of the first steps is, doing exactly what you're doing, Emily, which is you're self-scrutinizing, you're asking these questions, you're thinking about it, you're assessing your role, or maybe your role or somebody, or the role, let's say, of allies in this relationship. And so that's the key thing. I think I say to my students: scrutinize your positionality. What are you bringing to the table in terms of your class, your ethnicity? What are your privileges, and how might that affect the kinds of conversation you're trying to have? So that's step one, is something that you're doing already. I think the other thing is, is to listen. And there are lots of ways of finding out about Black history, through academic books, websites, through the arts, through radio programs. There's so many TV programs, documentaries at the moment. There's a wonderful documentary by Afua Hirsch about the African Renaissance, that tells you a lot about African culture. And there's been a wealth of documentaries about the Caribbean and the history of colonialism and enslavement as well. So I think that you don't rely on friends to tell you, what it's like to be Black, or what the challenges Black people face, but go and draw from this wealth of resources around you to find out more about that history, and then you come then to the table armed with knowledge, and by doing that, then you can better help the cause.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So Charlie wants to take us back to the conversation around the plantations in the Caribbean, and it's a bit like the statues debate, really. Is saying, or she's saying, or should I say they? It's International Pronouns Day today, so I shall make no assumptions. They are saying that if these establishments are so anathema to us, is there an argument for closing them down?
So and this is in relation to the stately homes or the plantation tours.
Yeah, the colonial establishments, the plantation tours, etc.
Is there an argument for closing them down?
Yeah, because if we did, would that hide the atrocities that occurred? Yeah,
I think as you say, Alison, I think it's a great question. I think we shouldn't close any of these historic places down, whether it's a stately home that has had money directly from the slave trade or Plantation Tour, because these are educational sites. So I think that they need to be used as an educational platform. It just needs to be done differently. And as Alison and I found out, I think through doing the statues review, is that you can change the narrative. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to change the narrative. Through presenting to the public a certain a type of history which is more balanced, which incorporates other voices, then you change the narrative. So I think that the Plantation Tour, it needs to be reconstructed, if you like, to not glamorize enslavement and not have that kind of nostalgia for the past at its heart, but the idea of a plantation tour in itself is an important one. I went on a plantation tour in Jamaica, and it was to a disused plantation, and it was done by a local academic, so it was very sensitively done, but it really, really brought home the reality of plantation life to me in a way that I don't think you could ever experience, if you weren't actually standing there in a place where all of these atrocities happened. So great question, and I think it just needs to be reframed, and the narrative needs to be changed rather than closing them down.
Yeah, and often when you're looking at the past, you don't always need to look at the side, the story of the oppressor, because if you think about Nazi Germany, you know, we don't want to go to Hitler's house. We want to go to the place where Jews were murdered, and that is enough for us to understand the scale and the depth of the horror that took place.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, shall I have this one from Jay? Is there any scope for local artists to respond to this subject? An exhibition exploring these stories would be really powerful.
Yes, Jay, I think it would, and this is the sort of, you know, that we're talking about using the arts as a platform for social justice, and painting is one of the key ways in which we can highlight these kinds of stories, and it's also a way that people from all generations, all ages, and from all different backgrounds can engage with. So I think there is absolutely scope for local artists to respond to this subject. It's a question of coordinating a project like that, but I think it could be a fascinating project, and it's a question also of finding the right kind of funding for that kind of project, and there are pockets of funding out there, but I don't know what position you're in, Jay, to be able to potentially pursue a project of this nature, but if you are in a position to, I think it would be fascinating. I'd be happy to talk further to you.
There's a really interesting question here, and it's triggering me in all sorts of ways as somebody who's experienced the reverse. So Emily, why are some light-skinned Black people prejudiced against darker-skinned people? And do you think Black people are racist?
Oh, okay. So that's a really interesting question. So why are some light-skinned Black people prejudiced against darker-skinned Black people? And do you think Black people are racist? A really interesting question. So this is one that really, you know, it's a question that really engages me, actually, because as you can see, I'm a light-skinned mixed race person. So my mother was much darker skinned than me, and my father is white. And my brother is much darker skinned than me. So I was a bit of an anomaly. My mother said she was waiting for several weeks for me to turn Black, and it didn't happen. So she had this blue-eyed, light-skinned, blonde-haired baby, and people used to think that she had adopted me, you know, or that she wasn't my mother. They couldn't put two and two together. When I was born, my Martinican grandmother said I was peau sauvée, which means saved skin in French. And this gives you an idea of the kind of pigmentocracy, we call it, the hierarchy of pigment that exists in the Caribbean. So the lighter skinned you were, and still is the case today, the lighter skinned you are, especially as a mixed race person, then the more you're, in a sense, able to access a different kind of life. And so this is also seen from a perspective of the beauty aesthetics as well. Anecdotally, when I was in Martinique, when I was 18, I had a boyfriend called Philou, who was very dark skinned. And the other Martinican girls would say, why are you going with Philou? He's too dark, he looks too African. So to look too African and to be too dark is seen as something negative. My grandfather, who's also very dark skinned, had a lot of racism in the Caribbean because of his face, which looked too African. And it was actually in coming to France that he felt more, he said, I quote, at home in my Black body. So I think that there is a long-standing issue of pigmentocracy in the Caribbean, and you see this in the Americas too. And this you know, links into prejudices that are established during enslavement, during colonialism. So, you know, it's the past living within our present, and I think that anybody can be racist. Anybody, nobody, you know, is off the hook in that sense, no matter what the color of your skin.
Yeah, And I think it's important to also highlight that I have experienced criticism from people who are not mixed race. So I'm also mixed race. My dad is from St Kitts and my mum's white Irish. And I have been told that I'm not black by black people. And so there is a dichotomy that exists within the black community. And we're all talking to each other about it because we need to be acting as one, but we all look different. And that's the name of the game. And also, I've got 2 children. I married a white man, so my children, well, one looks has got darker skin than the other, and the other looks white, except she's got my hair, not that I've got any hair. And she says that she really acknowledges her privilege of being able to pass. And if it's harder for her now that we've got Zoom, because I'm keep taking a cups of tea and all her work colleagues see me and go, oh, who's that woman? So now they know that she's black because they've seen me. But it is a big debate amongst the black community.
It is, Alison, and there is that sense that perhaps if you're mixed race, you're neither here nor there, that you don't belong in either community, and there may be also a desire to feel that you belong more rooted in one particular community, and in some ways, though, being mixed also tests some of those quite fixed ideas about race. So that if people say, oh, all black people behave like this, or dress like this, or dance like this, and all white people behave like this, if you're mixed, you challenge those binaries. And Absolutely. People don't like that. People don't like people who challenge binaries. And that can be people within, any community. It destabilizes some of those kind of constructs on which ideas about race are built. And so just for an example, in America, black friends would say to me, how do you define yourself? And I say, I'm mixed. And they say, that's not even a racial category, you're black. And I said, well, in the UK, you can actually define yourself as mixed, but it's very important in the States to claim, the definition of blackness. And that's also rooted in the idea that this so-called one drop rule, that you'd only have to be one drop black to be defined as black in the segregated America.
Oh, we've got another really contentious one here. How do you personally feel about the term coloured? My dad used to use that term, but he came from 50s Caribbean. I lived and worked in South Africa for a number of years, and this was a proud statement and identification to my host family. However, there are obviously very questionable connotations with the term.
Yes, it's a language. Language changes. It's redefined. Language is in constant flux. It's constantly being reinvented, and I think terms which may have been suited one context then can become no longer appropriate in another context. The actual term "coloured" is a very outdated term, considered quite problematic in the UK. Obviously, it had a different connotation, in South Africa, and I'm not sure, when that might have, the period to which you're referring to. But I think that we need to just keep evolving in terms of the use of our terminology, because language can be violent and language can offend. So if we do use a term and people correct us, then I think we need to stand corrected. And not try and defend it. If the terminology you're using upsets someone, then you just have to sit with the fact that upset them and change the way you talk. It's not much work to do. So it's an interesting question, and it's interesting, because of, as you point out, Charlie, that the way that terminology changes. But yes, I would say that in the present day UK, it's considered a dated and problematic term.
Yeah, and obviously we've described ourselves as mixed race, and that's because I'm in my 50s. I don't know how old you are, you look much younger than that. But that's how we were brought up. We're supposed to say dual heritage now. Yes. I forget because I am so old. But yes, let's be comfortable with the language we describe ourselves, but also be open to the language that other people use to describe themselves. And it brings to mind the whole debate about BAME and the work that Inc. Arts have done about BAME Over. So please do look on the website for BAME Over, because there's some really, really useful analysis has been done following some work of the Inc. Arts organisation.
Yes, absolutely. Very convincing work.
Yeah, absolutely. I try now to say Black African Caribbean, Black African and Caribbean, and Southeast Asian people who have experienced racism. That's it in a sort of nutshell, but there's so much more to it.
And Alison, interestingly, it seems that the question from Astrid is exactly about that.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say, I've been saying to my students, you know, we need to move on from using that term, because it's just it's a term which collapses a huge group of people into one thing, you know, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And the idea of being minority ethnic, I also sometimes end up using that term because I've used it in the past so often. So I use it, and then I feel then I think, oh, you know, why have I used that term again? Because actually, you know, these are not minority ethnic. We're not minority ethnic on a global scale. This is, you know, majority ethnic in many ways. So it's a collapsing of a huge number of people into one term, and what it could be seen as a way of othering people, you know, us and them. Everybody who is not, you know, white or is then the other, is the you know, Black, Asian, minority ethnic. So there are all sorts of issues that term. I do think that we need to get rid of it.
Exactly. Helen?
Yeah, I was just aware of time. Have we got time for one more? Do we think?
Question?
Yeah, which was just one. I think it's disappeared off things now, but when I saw about how do you know that you were reading the most helpful stuff? I think there was a comment around reading White Fragility that's been criticised somewhere else. So I suppose it's, yeah, where do you go to know you're reading the right or the most helpful, I suppose?
Well, I would say it's you want to check your sources, and I think although in academic study there's writing by people from a whole range of ethnicities, which is incredibly useful for understanding Black history. If you're trying to find out more about, you know, what it means to be Black and what the experiences of Black people are, then you want to read something which is written by a person of colour. But just in response to that, I will also put a list together of some of the best resources that I've come across in terms of educating yourself around this history, and that could be sent round by Helen and Alison to our participants.
Absolutely brilliant.
Great, thank you.
In the last 2 minutes, there's a big question here, but it's an easy answer.
Oh, Alison.
What's your opinion on positive discrimination, and how do organisations avoid tokenism?
This is a difficult question to end on, isn't it? Because it's such a big question, as you say, Alison. I think positive discrimination is important in the sense that we need to have a balance of different people in any group. So, you know, for example, I work in the School of Cultural Studies in Leeds Beckett University. There's around 30 of us academics. Now, if there was mainly white male academics, you know, within that group, what we would produce would be a bias. It would reflect the positionality, the privileges of that group of academics. So when, you know, when they're recruiting new staff, if in a job advert it encourages women to apply, or it encourages people of colour to apply, I think that's incredibly important, because we need to actively seek a balance of representation.
But of course, that's positive action. It's not positive discrimination, which is illegal.
Yeah. Yes, exactly, Alison. So that kind of positive action is really important. But how do organisations avoid tokenism? What would you say, Alison, in response to that? How does your...
Then I personally think it's about embedding inclusion into everything you do. So if you've got a tick box way of working, that will come through in the culture of the organisation. If you are committed to inclusion of all difference, protected characteristics from age, sexual orientation, gender, and race and ethnicity, that will come through in your practice, your policy, the way that you engage staff, the way you recruit staff, the way you retain staff. Every aspect of the work that you do, including the service users or the customers that you have, depending on what sector you're in, all that will be really clear like a golden thread. So actually, I think that where I work, we are really well known for that inclusion, but we didn't start from there, and organisations need to understand that if they don't have it embedded in the organisation, they will be outed as being practitioners of tokenism, and that's clearly not something that anybody wants to be accused of. So let's all work together to embed inclusion in our working practices and in the communities that we serve, and we'll all benefit from that.
Yeah, and yes, and as you say, if there's inclusion is at the very heart of what the organisation does and how the organisation practices, then there can never be that there can't be that accusation of tokenism.
So we are 12:31, and we said we'd finish at 12:30. There's a couple of questions we haven't been able to answer, and maybe we'll be able to do that through the email exchange at the end. Helen's is going to end the session, but I just wanted to say thank you from Touchstone. Thank you, Emily, for agreeing to speak today. And hopefully this is the start of a beautiful relationship, and we'll be able to work together on other things going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alison. It's been a real pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that really and say thank you from Leeds Mind. I think we are more towards the start of a journey, which is part of the reason we've partnered with Touchstone over Black History Month, because we really want to learn. And, you know, today has just been really interesting, so much food for thought. And thank you so much for your time and your insights. And yes, I'm sure we will be in touch and stay in touch in the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen. And could I also thank the audience for such engaging and interesting questions that's really kind of propelled the conversations into all sorts of important places. So it's been a pleasure to engage with you and with you, Alison and Helen. And yet, long may these kind of dialogues and conversations continue. And let's make sure we also create that email of resources for people who've asking questions about sources that they can draw from in this debate.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody for attending.
Yeah, thank
Goodbye.
you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.